Hello, friends. Welcome back to the Story Man. Today's story is called 50 Paise Memories. The Terminal 1 at the Delhi airport was a sea of glowing screens and frantic travelers. Neil sat on a cold metal chair, staring grim-faced at the delayed sign on the flight board. A woman in a charcoal grey trench coat sat next to him, sighing as she tucked a thick, leather-bound journal into her bag. Technology is supposed to make travel faster, yet here we are, she muttered, glancing once towards her grim-faced neighbor. Neil smiled. Sometimes I think the more we advance in technologies, the more restless we become. As for example, look at the 90s. Back then, at least if you were late, nobody could track you down and complain about it in real time. The woman laughed, a warm, resonant sound. True, you just stayed late and people assumed you were on your way. Well, by the way, I'm Meera, stuck on the way to Bangalore. Neil this side, heading to Kolkata, he replied. To pass the time, they fell into the easy rhythm of two strangers sharing a casual conversation. They talked about their jobs. She was an architect, he was a history professor. But the conversation drifted, as it often does with people of certain vintage, back in their childhoods. Good to see you with the journal. These days it is a rare sight to see one sitting with a journal, and that too inside a busy airport. Thanks to our electronic boss, always reminding of us of its presence. He mischievously sung his iPhone a few times. Meera laughed, this time heartily. I was just looking at my journal, she said, tracing the leather cover. My daughter thinks I'm ancient because I don't use a tablet. But I grew up with the smell of ink. I can't let it go. I get it, Neil said, leaning back. I still have a drawer full of old fountain pens. Chelpark Blue was the scent of my entire teenage life. You know, I used to be a chronic letter writer. Meera's eyes brightened. No way. Like someone with a pen pal? Bang on, ma'am, Neil said with a smile. There was a distant look in his eyes. You know, we wrote for 6 years, 1992 to 1998. It was the only thing that kept me sane in that boarding school in Dehradun. For some reason, Meera went quiet for a while. Dehradun? You know, even I used to write to a boy in a boarding school in Dehradun. I lived in a small tea estate in Assam back then. Neil suddenly felt a strange kick inside his head. He looked at her more closely. Assam? My pen pal lived in a place called Dick Boy. Sometimes she used to send me pressed ferns in her letters. Meera's breath hitched. The ferns would always be flat by the time they reached because I would put them inside the thickest book I owned back then. I had those book series called Tell Me Why. Suddenly the noise of the airport seemed to vanish for both the strangers. The announcements, the rolling suitcases, the cacophony of busy travelers, it all fell away. Meera? Neil asked, his voice barely a whisper. Did you once tell the boy that your dream was to build a house made of glass so that during night you could see the stars from every room? Meera's eyes glistened with moisture, and the boy used to tell me that he was secretly trying to build a time machine so that he could go back in time to visit his deceased parents who had died of a car crash. Time traveler? Neil said, using the old nickname he had signed off for years. Fern girl, she replied, her voice trembling. For a moment, they sat in stunned silence. For 6 years, they had shared their souls through letters, their fears of board exams, their first heartbreaks, their secret poems. Then, Eventually, they moved to college, letters got lost in transit, and the digital age swept their paper trails away. They had never exchanged photos, they had only known each other through the curvature of their handwriting. "I looked for you," Neil said, his voice thick with emotion. "When Orkut came out, then Facebook, I searched for Mira from Dig Boy. There were thousands, I kept the letters." Mira wiped a tear, laughing through the shock. "They're in a liquid box under my bed. I have lived in 4 cities, Neil, but the box moved with me every single time." They spent the next hour talking, not as the architect and the professor, but as 2 little kids who had emerged from history. They filled the gaps of 25 years in 25 minutes. Then, suddenly there was an announcement. "Final boarding call for flight 6E212 to Bangalore." Mira stood up gently, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. "I have to go, Neil," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I know." Neil stood up too. In the 90s, they would have promised to write. They would have waited weeks for a response. Now, he could have asked her for her number, her Instagram, her life in a series of pixels. But as they stood there, the weight of the emotions they had once shared through letters felt too sacred to be turned into a WhatsApp contact. Mira reached out and squeezed his hand. Then, without thinking anything more, suddenly hugged him. Neil held her tightly for a moment, tear in his eyes. A brief moment. Mira began to walk away towards the gate. After a few steps, she paused and looked back. "Neil?" "Yes." "Don't search for me in Facebook," she smiled, a sad, beautiful glint in her eyes. "Send me an inland letter and tell me about your time travel." "I'll need to find a post office first." Neil's voice broke a few times. "I'll be waiting by," she whispered. She turned and within a few minutes vanished in the crowd. Neil kept standing near his seat as the announcement continued a few times. "Final boarding call for flight 6E212 to Bangalore." Thanks for hearing, guys.